Welcome to Community Roundtable. I'm Nick Burns from the Salt Lake Community College Division of Communication and Performing Arts, and I'm your host as we explore topics of special interest and concern to the residents of the cities and also the unincorporated areas of Salt Lake County. And these are topics that we feel are equally important to the general public throughout all the state of Utah. Today on Community Roundtable, our focus is education, specifically diversity, inclusion in higher education. We'll talk about access to higher education, and we'll talk about problems facing students of color. Our guest today, he works as a special assistant to the president here at Salt Lake Community College, and he's very involved in issues of inclusion, equity, diversity, and access. Dr. Roderic Land, welcome to Community Roundtable.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah. So you and I mean, full disclosure, you and I already know each other, and we've done some work together on committees, but for our audience, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got to Salt Lake Community College.
The long story or the short story?
Oh gosh, what fits you better?
Well, I would say primarily I came to Utah about 11 years ago. I came here to be a professor at the University of Utah in the College of Education and also Ethnic Studies. And so I was there for about 7 years, and then after that I left the academy and went to work for the Salt Lake County Mayor's office as one of his cabinet members there. And then from there, this wonderful opportunity at the Salt Lake Community College has come up, and I applied for it, and that's what landed me here at the college.
So how'd you end up as a professor to begin with?
Great question. Well, I would say that how I initially started to be a professor, of course you go through grad school and all those kind of things, but my background actually was I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And so, yeah, I wanted to prescribe medicine and get people all drugged up and diagnose all those kind of things. But nevertheless, I got burnt out with the sciences in undergrad. And so I went the grad school route, became a licensed therapist, and then I wanted to have a larger impact on communities at large. And so the therapy sessions were great, but it was one-on-one. I used to enjoy the group therapy, all those kind of things. But how could I have a larger impact? And so I went into educational policy. That way you can have a larger impact on larger communities. And from there, it led into a professorship position.
So I mean, you and then into government and in essence politics, and now back to education.
Yes, sir.
So there ought to be a joke in that being a therapist is somehow good for being a politician.
I think a lot of politicians can use therapy.
So LCSW or an MSW?
LC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ah, congratulations. That's what my sister does, if anybody wants to know. So when it comes to educational policy, and so when it comes to higher education, what were you specifically interested in researching and doing?
Well, one of the biggest issues that I oftentimes run into was that people would say, well, why are there not enough faculty of color within the ranks of professorships, right? And so my thought process was maybe there's something wrong with the pipeline. And so what my research was in grad school was to study the experiences of TAs of color in predominantly white classroom settings.
Okay.
And so that kind of led me to thinking about, well, if it's not an issue of a dearth of qualified applicants, then there has to be something else that's there. And so from that research, what I gathered was that the experiences that some of those TAs had was very critical to their life trajectory in terms of what they want to see or what they want to do in terms of the academy. And so some of them chose not to pursue the professorship because of what they experienced within the classrooms in that particular area. And so that changed over into studying broader issues in terms of not just within the classroom settings or university settings, but also the K through 12 system. And so for me, I see education not just as higher ed or K through 12, but it's a spectrum, if you will, K through 16 or K through 20 for that matter. And so thinking about the various social factors that contribute to a student's success or lack thereof, those are the kind of things that I try to pay attention to.
In your research looking at teaching assistants and whether people choose to drop out or keep going, were there distinctions between graduate students in the humanities or the sciences?
No.
Didn't matter. Interesting.
No, and I would say it didn't matter between whether you were a TA or a full professor. Because in that process of doing that study, I had the opportunity of actually interviewing full professors, people at the associate professor rank, assistant professor, and TAs. And for those professors and TAs of color, those experiences were consistent across the board.
Interesting. So much for President Obama when he was first elected and talking about post-racial America?
Yeah.
It doesn't really sound so true.
No, I would say not so much.
even in academia, which is supposed to be the place where everything is so great.
Yeah, and so with that idea of this idea of a post-racial society, one of the things, or one of the arguments that I oftentimes make is this: okay, so once Obama was elected, did the achievement gap close? Did infant mortality rates diminish, or did incarceration rates between people of color and whites diminish in some way, shape, fashion, or form? And the answer is no. I mean, they still persist, and I would say they're even growing to a large degree even to this day. And so for this discourse, this idea that we somehow live in a post-racial society, I think is completely asinine. And I think we are really missing a wonderful opportunity to have these conversations about race. And I would say with the various things that's going on within the country, whether you're talking about South Carolina or the various incidents with police-involved shootings or things of that nature, this is a ripe time to really delve into these conversations.
It seems like people maybe are finally listening.
Well,
or at least the dominant culture is finally listening, maybe.
I would say they're maybe admitting that there is something to it. And I would say that because you can't help but to hear and see the various things that are going on. I mean, unless your head is in the sand somewhere, right?
Yeah, I could go somewhere there, but I won't. But I mean, nonetheless, you think about these issues and how important they are and how people are still disenfranchised, and I want to talk about Salt Lake Community College specifically,
Right.
But yet here we are, a white man talking to a black man, and you're the expert in this rather than somebody who's white. I mean, it seems like it's the minority community who has to continually bring this up and sort of throw it in front of the dominant culture to get something happening.
But that's the tricky part about the racial politics of this country, right? And so to your point about a white man talking to a black man about claiming to be an expert, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in it.
Okay.
However, but a lot of times when you make the comment that a lot of times the minority individuals have to bring these conversations up, but a lot of times it's not heard until it's a different messenger. Right, and so that becomes the politics of the race within our country. And so to say, if you say, for instance, like we'll say a Tim Wise or a Joe Fagan or somebody of that stature, to say the various things that I may be saying on the same television show, if you made the comments that I want to make, then it may be perceived or received very differently. And so I would say that given the racial history of our country, the messenger oftentimes will shade the message, right? Or how it's perceived will be very different.
So here you are from Chicago, right?
Yes, sir.
Here you are in Utah. How do you think your message gets told with you as the spokesperson in a state like this?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know how it's perceived, to be honest with you. Only thing I can do is provide the message. And the thing is people can receive it how they choose to. Because I think one of the biggest issues that we run up against for the folks who are doing the kind of work that I do is that we may have the idea or the tendency to say that we have to change people's minds, right? Well, if you realize the fact that we all have bad habits, and if you think about those bad habits, how difficult they are to change ourselves. So how can I then come in and change your bad habit? And I think having this conversation about race, racism, or any other form of oppression, I mean, those are years and years of socialization. Because I would say nobody's born, to be an oppressor to a large degree. And so we have to ask the question, well, how did they come to know or understand these various characteristics or disinformation for that matter? And what I've oftentimes said is that, our parents are our first teachers. So they have to get it from somewhere. And so if you think about, again, coming back from Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that was back in the 1960s. But yet in 2015, we're still facing a lot of the same issues that we were in the 1960s. And so to suggest that somehow if we get laws in the books, we get a black president, somehow this whole issue of race dissipates. I would argue oftentimes is that change laws does not equal change minds, right? And so there's a intergenerational philosophy or idea that has persisted throughout the years that we still are dealing with to this day. And just the same way to say that we have folks who are resisting the oppression, we have folks who are resisting those folks who are trying to change.
I mean, incredible pushback too, right?
Absolutely.
That you see a little bit of change and then people sort of freak out and push back. When we come back, I want to bring this closer to home and talk about Salt Lake Community College more specifically. This is Community Roundtable. Keep it tuned. We'll be right back with more. We are back on Community Roundtable, talking today with Dr. Roderic Land, who is a special assistant to the president here at Salt Lake Community College. And when we left off, we were talking about sort of national issues in this sort of fantasy or fallacy of a post-racial United States. But here you are at Salt Lake Community College, here we all are at Salt Lake Community College, and we are the most diverse institution in the state in terms of students from all different backgrounds. Yep. And we also lead the state in diversity of faculty, which I think is kind of interesting, and staff. So when it comes to your work, what are you doing here in terms of either policy change or on-the-ground student work?
So, I mean, to kind of come back to your comments about us being one of the most diverse institutions within the state of Utah, then also leading diversity in terms of faculty ranks, is kind of, how can I say this, politically correct.
Not true?
I wouldn't say it's not true, but I mean, it's like, in the land of the blind, the man with one eye is king.
Okay.
Right? And so you have to understand who you're comparing yourself against. And so understanding also that Utah is still one of the most monolithic states, homogeneous states that we have within our union, that we can take that with a grain of salt to some degree. However, I will say that, you know, we are doing a good job in terms of trying to improve our efforts to diversify, not just our student body, but also our faculty and staff. And so with that idea that we are one of the most diverse, I mean, there's still some issues that we do see persisting here within the college. If you look at our completion rates across the board, I mean, they're relatively low. But if you start to disaggregate that data and look at ethnic minority students specifically, you start to see a drop, more specifically looking at our Pacific Islander and our indigenous students as well. Mm-hmm. And their persistence rates or retention rates is about, what, 24% and 22% respectively. And so that we're saying like 1 out of 4 Pacific Islanders are gonna be retained, and that's not something to hang our hats on. That's pretty sad. Right. Yeah. And then not to mention, if we think about the higher numbers of African Americans and Latinos being 48 and 49% respectively, I mean, you're still saying 1 out of 2 are being retained. And so our goal should be, how do we retain all of our students who desire to be retained, right? And we can't ignore the idea that some of our ideas of success, i.e. being completion, may not be synonymous to those students in terms of, well, I just want to come here and take a class or get a certificate, and it may not resonate as being completion. Right. And so there's 2 sides to that coin that we have to be very cautious and considerate about.
Right. I mean, we can twist the statistics any number of ways. How does Salt Lake Community College compare in terms of completion of students of color compared to other community colleges, either in the Intermountain West or nationally?
The unfortunate thing is it's almost the same across the board. Okay. Right? And that's the sad reality. And I think that one of the things that we have to consider are the various social factors that contribute to these issues of retention, right? Okay. And so it's not one of those things to say, well, you know, it's just a student's fault in terms of why they are not completing. But we have a responsibility as an institution. Whenever a student comes into our doors or walks into our campus, they are our responsibility. So it becomes incumbent upon us to say, well, how do we help the student succeed in the fashion in which they want to succeed, right? But then also to suggest that, well, if we have to redefine success, to say, well, can success just be monolithic in the sense that it is about completion? Now I know in terms of, from a policy perspective, as an institution, we have to have that hat on because that's part of how we're being funded on performance. And so as a community college, it's very different because I mean, we're getting students across the spectrum, from those students who barely graduated from high school or did not graduate high school at all and went on to get a GED, to those students who are super cum laude and everything in between. And then also we're talking about students who are coming out of high school, then also people are coming back from the workforce, want to retool, reinvent themselves, parents, single moms. And so our student population is extremely diverse. And so to think how we can define success in one way, it's kind of difficult in that fashion.
I mean, what you're talking about is a huge split between looking at who walks in the door, but who walks out, right. Whether it's a degree, certificate, skill set, right. Whatever, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And it sounds like overall you're kind of condemning higher education everywhere as sort of failing a lot of students.
Well, I wouldn't just say higher education, I would say the educational system, right? Okay. From K through 16, K through 20, 22, whatever the case may be. Because students did not just not be college ready once they walk through the doors. There's something that was happening within that education prior to, right? And so as I mentioned before, I mean, I don't see education as just these siloed spaces of higher education and K through 12 system, but there's this continuous spectrum of education. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, if we know that the system that we currently have is not working for all of our students, then what is it that we can do differently to ensure that we give our students the best chance of succeeding? And so I would liken this to the idea of, I make it personal quite often to say, well, I'll ask the question, do you have children? It's rhetorical for you, but we can say, sure, you have children, right? And if you have multiple children, we say you have 3 children. Now, if there was something that you were doing as a parent and understanding that those 3 students, those 3 children are very different, then do you treat them all the same? And the answer is probably not, because each one of those students require different things to help them succeed. And so one of the ideas that we have as a country to a large degree is that we want to see this one homogeneous system of education in which we have multiple personalities, multiple learning characteristics that comes in through our doors. So how do we just put this blanket of pedagogical practices and say, hey, this is the best practice for everybody, when everybody, I would say, learns differently to a large degree. And so as a system, K through 20, then we have to ask ourselves the question, are we doing what's right on behalf of all those students who are coming through our doors? And if we're thinking about the fact that we live within a global society, and we are really pushing this whole idea of nationalism, patriotism, I oftentimes ask the question, how patriotic are we truly if we're not educating all of our kids within the nation?
Do you see those problems systematically and structurally different in Utah for education than other states in terms of preparing kids for college?
Well, I would say that, Utah has been at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of funding per pupil. And what I would argue from an economic standpoint is not so much, again, how much we spend, but what are we doing with those dollars? What's the cost-benefit analysis in terms of what are we, the kind of programming that we're doing, or the kind of pedagogical practice that we're actually implementing within the classrooms? And I would say that more than anything, then also thinking about, again, as teachers, instructors, professors, facilitators of this knowledge, how do we ensure that we are relating with our students, right? And so not to say that it's all on the teachers, but then also let's look at this more holistically in terms of saying, okay, what's the environment that child is coming from? What's the home life like? What are the parents' educational levels? What are the parents working? So there are multiple social factors that contribute to a child's academic success. And I think we run ourselves ragged trying to figure out, okay, well, if we are just an educational system, then that's all we focus on is education. But as a child comes into a classroom, that's not all that they're focused on, because they bring a whole life experience with them into that seat. And so we can't ignore that. And oftentimes as educators, we do. We try to silo that child out and ignore the various social factors that they bring to the table.
And I don't just see that with the educators, but you see that from the policy people, right? Let's punish the teachers when the kids fail. And you have a kid that's hungry, mom's working 3 jobs, whatever, right? And that's totally ignored, that component. So it seems to me we have a system in Utah that even though it's really low funded compared to elsewhere and our class sizes are huge, it seems to work pretty well for the upper middle class dominant culture white kids, whereas the high school graduation rate for Hispanics and everything is fairly dismal. And
so if you think about it in that sense, right, again, coming back to this whole idea of patriotism, nationalism, I don't want to condemn the whole system, because it does work for some people, right? So we have to be very intentional and innovative to a large degree about how we implement education. Because again, it's like to say that if we just have this one blanket system and it only works for part of the people, then what about those other folks who are not matriculating, who are not being successful? And then again, there's multiple sides to that story, because again, you do have a system that's in place, but then also you have I would say the motivation of those individual students who, whether or not they want to succeed or not succeed. But I would argue that nobody does not want to succeed.
Right. It's like who gets to set the parameters of success, right?
Right, exactly.
When we come back, I want to talk about that some more and talk about things that are exactly happening for different students here at Salt Lake Community College.
Okay, wonderful.
We'll be back talking with Dr. Roderic Land after this. Keep it tuned to Community Roundtable. We We are back on Community Roundtable talking with Dr. Roderic Land, Special Assistant to the President here at Salt Lake Community College. So right here at Salt Lake Community College, 60–70% of students are from families that have had no one ever go to college before, so they're first generation college, which is very different than the kids at Princeton or even the U, where mommy and daddy are accountants. So you've got all these students, like you say, everybody wants to be successful in his or her own way, but a lot of these students don't have any sort of background or any sort of support beyond a general you go kid. So what all are we doing here for like that population?
So to your point about nearly 70%, I'd say about 65–64% of our students are first generation students. What comes along with that, to your point again, is that dearth of knowledge in terms of how do we navigate higher ed systems, right? From even applying for college to filling out a FAFSA, which becomes critical in terms of how we're paying for college. And I would say that's one of our biggest issues that we see up to this point in terms of students not completing the FAFSA forms. And that becomes an impediment to some degree in terms of how they are even accessing college or being able to pay for college. And so some of the things that we're trying to do now at the college, one, we do have a first year experience cohort of students where they are students who are first year experience for sure, but there's support systems that are centered around them to help them navigate the college campus, the college life, college experience. And so with that, we've seen some success in that program with the first year experience. So the question becomes not just the first year experience, so once they get through that, what happens with their second year? And I think to a large degree, that's what a lot of our college and universities are struggling with at this point. So once they get through that first cohorted year, then they're kind of left to their own devices. Like, yeah, good luck, figure it out. And so, so it's like, well, we've carried you this way now. You're still a baby, and then just move on.
You throw them out of the nest, in effect.
And so I would say that there's some more work to be done in that regard. To say, well, what can we do to follow up as a follow-up? And with that second year, particularly at a community college where we know I would say some of our students are looking for that 2-year degree or just transfer credits and moving on. And so we only have them for a limited amount of time. But then also thinking about how long it's taken some students to finish. Because not all, I would say majority of our students are taking about anywhere from 6 to 9-hour credits. So most of our students are part-time students because they're either working, they have family responsibilities or other obligations outside of the college structure. And not to mention that you may be, again, that first generation student who's coming to a college. So all those things coupled with this idea, okay, coming back to the definition of success, how can we ensure the success of these students? And so again, with the first year experience is huge, but I would also caution us to say we can do more in a sense of continuing that those wraparound services to that second year.
I mean, that's really hard because first year you've got everybody taking their, beginning writing, beginning communication, whatever it is. But second year you've got some people going to engineering, some people going to biology. But even the elite East Coast schools understand cohorts help students and set those things up.
Absolutely.
So it seems a shame that if we're doing great on the first year and then you sort of just like go fly. So specifically, I mean, continue to arrange how schedules can be set up for students to keep students together in cohorts? And
I would say that some of those conversations have happened in terms of just brainstorming ideas. I mean, we don't want to be so rigorous in the sense of, I say so structured, that's probably a better word, in terms of how we're looking at our students' courses. But we do understand that that does help in some spaces. And so you have to ask yourself, there's a fine balance where you have to ask yourself the question, how structured do we want to be to ensure the success versus how much freedom do we want to give students to kind of pick and choose their courses, right? But to the point about being cohorted, I think there's a way that you can definitely cohort students, but still have that flexibility within that cohort.
What's being done in terms of helping faculty understand that different students just learn differently?
I think our FTLC does a phenomenal job with that when it's all said and done. They've asked me to come in to give a couple of workshops about the diversity of curriculum, pedagogical strategies, and then also thinking about just what the faculty in themselves bring to the table. And I would say that I think we're doing a better job at that. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. Because we still do see the achievement gap that persists when you disaggregate that data across racial lines. And also class lines to a large degree as well. And so, I think as faculty, we have an outstanding faculty here at the college. I would not want to short them in any way, shape, fashion, or form, but I would also say that we have to do better because we do see the changing demographics of Utah, and so what does that then mean for the way that we do education or the way that we implement education? That has to somewhat shift because, again, everybody do not learn the same.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So again, only a couple minutes left, and that's a good place to wrap this up maybe, and that is we do have demographics changing rapidly in Utah. Huge influx of students who are Latino at the community college. So in terms of your own work, what's the next step?
So to keep challenging our faculty, staff, and students, this whole concept of inclusivity, equity, and diversity, I would say the inclusivity piece versus diversity would be one of those things where you're actually starting to bring action to the concept of diversity, where there's been kind of this mantra, if you will, diversity is being asked to the party, and inclusive is actually dancing at the party, right?
Okay.
And so for us here at the college, we have to be very intentional about our actions to a large degree, and be very cautious and very conscious of the students who are coming into our classrooms. And so if we think about how we are trying to do so much in terms of recruiting and bringing students in, how do we retain them, right? And the same thing for faculty and staff in the same light. And so I would say in terms of what we do here at the college, we have to be very intentional about asking the questions about why we're doing the work that we're doing. And for me, it's about how do we help other people progress every day? And how do we help the students progress? How do we help faculty progress? How do we help staff progress? Because at the end of the day, if we're not here to, I would say, to help each other, then why are we here?
You seem very unique. We've only got a minute left, but you seem very unique in the world of education, that you see things very holistically. Yeah. Because oftentimes people get pretty compartmentalized.
Well, I think that's just the structure of education to a large degree. And so if you think about how going through grad school, I'll say going from undergrad to grad school, it's kind of like a triangle. So you have undergrad as this broad base of knowledge and information, and as you go up the ladder towards your master's and your Ph.D. becomes much more focused. And so I would say to a large degree, our system is designed to be very siloed.
Sad but true.
Yeah.
Continue the good work. Thanks for being here. Thank you for joining us on Community Roundtable. If you have a comment, you have a question, maybe you have an idea for a future show, get in touch. Our email address, roundtable@slcctv.com. And don't forget, you can catch all our episodes archived at slcctv.com. I'm Nick Burns. Keep it tuned to SLCC TV.